Beyond the gate, spoilers teased that a crisis was brewing in Fairmont Crest, and its epicenter was Allison. From the outside, she seemed composed, polished hair, tasteful clothing, the kind of smile that could pass for graciousness in the right light. But beneath the surface, there was a storm, the kind that could only be born from desire twisted into resentment. It had started months earlier, with an affair that was never meant to be anything more than a reckless escape. Chelsea had been that escape, someone who could see past Allison's role as Craig's wife, past the picture-perfect marriage, into the restless woman beneath. They had kept it hidden from everyone, even from Madison, Chelsea's closest confidant. But secrecy, as intoxicating as it was, eventually began to feel heavy. It was Allison, of all people, who decided they needed to stop. Guilt had been gnawing at her, guilt for betraying Craig, for living a lie that contradicted the image she had worked so hard to maintain. "This isn't fair to him," she had told Chelsea one night, voice low, almost trembling. "Craig deserves honesty, even if I can't give it to him yet." Chelsea had agreed. She'd even admired Allison's resolve in that moment, thinking perhaps they could part without bitterness. But she underestimated the complexity of Allison's emotions. Ending the affair didn't erase the bond they'd formed. It didn't erase the hunger that Allison now had no acceptable outlet for. And while Chelsea had moved forward, Allison began to feel as if something vital had been taken from her. That was when Madison entered the picture in a new way. Chelsea and Madison had always been friends, but now that Chelsea was no longer entangled with Allison, their connection deepened. It started with casual dinners, late-night conversations, shared jokes that made Chelsea laugh in a way Allison hadn't heard in months. To anyone else, it would have looked harmless. To Allison, it was a betrayal. The irony was bitter. She had been the one to suggest ending things, yet now she felt abandoned. She told herself it wasn't about romance, it was about control. Chelsea was hers, in some indefinable way, and seeing her choose Madison over her felt like an insult that couldn't be ignored. Allison began to insert herself back into Chelsea's life under the guise of concern. Text messages at odd hours. Just checking in. Dropping by unannounced with excuses, forgotten items, mutual friends needing updates, fabricated errands. Sometimes Chelsea entertained these visits out of politeness. Other times, she shut the door quickly, citing a busy schedule. But the more Chelsea resisted, the more relentless Allison became. Her pleas grew bolder, more desperate. "We can go back to how it was," she said one afternoon, cornering Chelsea in the back hallway of the Fairmont Crest event hall. "You can't tell me you don't miss it." Chelsea's reply was calm but firm. "I don't. It was the right decision, Allison. For both of us." The refusal cut deeper than Allison expected. She walked away with a tight smile, but inside, something shifted, a crack forming in the facade she had so carefully built. It wasn't long before her behavior turned erratic. The first incident came when Allison staged a minor accident during a community event, claiming she'd twisted her ankle. She made a scene, limping dramatically, insisting Chelsea be the one to help her. Chelsea did, though her expression betrayed irritation more than sympathy. Later, she confronted Allison privately. "This has to stop," Chelsea warned. "Whatever you're trying to do, it's not going to work." Allison brushed it off with a laugh. "You think I'm faking injuries for your attention? That's ridiculous." But it wasn't. And Chelsea knew it. The second incident was worse. Allison called Chelsea in a breathless panic, claiming she'd fallen down her back steps and needed help immediately. Chelsea arrived only to find her sitting comfortably in the kitchen, sipping tea. No bruises, no limp, just a satisfied look, as though Chelsea's presence was proof enough that she still cared. "That's the last time, Allison," Chelsea had said sharply, refusing to sit down. "I will not be manipulated by you. I'm not coming back, and I'm not going to let you ruin what I have with Madison." The words were blunt, final. And they landed like a blow. From that moment on, something darker took root in Allison. She began watching Chelsea and Madison together whenever she could, looking for moments to twist into evidence of betrayal. Each laugh, each touch on the arm, each shared glance became fuel for her growing resentment. The breaking point came one crisp evening in late autumn. Chelsea and Madison were outside the Fairmont Crest cafe, sitting at a small table, steaming mugs between them. Madison said something. Chelsea laughed, her head tipping back, eyes bright. Allison saw it from across the street. Her chest tightened, heat rising up her neck. She told herself she was just going to walk past, that she could handle it. But the closer she got, the more that heat turned to fire. By the time she was within a few steps, her hand had closed around the handle of the kitchen knife she'd tucked into her coat pocket earlier that day. She hadn't planned it, not exactly, but the thought had been there, lingering, whispering. In those final moments before the chaos, her mind blurred. She saw Madison's smile, Chelsea's open joy, and felt herself pushed beyond reason. She lunged forward, the knife glinting briefly under the cafe lights. Chelsea saw the movement before Madison did. Without thinking, she pushed Madison out of the way and stepped into the blade's path. The sound was sickening, a thud, a gasp, and then Chelsea was on the ground, blood spreading across her blouse. Everything happened at once. Madison screamed, dropping to her knees beside Chelsea. Craig, who had been walking up from the corner, ran forward, grabbing for the knife. In the struggle, the blade sliced across his hand, sending a bright arc of blood onto the pavement. Ashley, who had been inside the cafe, rushed out, her phone already in hand, calling for an ambulance. Allison's face was pale, her breathing ragged. For a moment, she seemed almost confused, as though she hadn't fully realized what she'd done until now. Then the shouts of bystanders broke through, and the first sirens wailed in the distance. Chelsea lay still, her breathing shallow, her skin cold. Madison pressed napkins from the cafe against the wound, hands shaking. "Stay with me," she pleaded. "Stay with me, Chelsea." Craig, his injured hand hastily wrapped with a dish towel from a passerby, stood guard until the police arrived. When they did, they moved in quickly, pulling Allison back. She didn't resist, only muttered something under her breath, words no one could quite catch. As the paramedics loaded Chelsea onto the stretcher, Madison's face was streaked with tears. Craig's expression was grim, his jaw tight with pain and fury. Ashley hovered close, her voice trembling as she relayed what had happened to the officers. And Allison, she was led away, her eyes still fixed on the spot where Chelsea had fallen, as though she couldn't look anywhere else. The night in Fairmont Crest had turned colder, sharper. And nothing would be the same again. The hospital's fluorescent lights were harsh, casting pale shadows over every face in the waiting area. Madison sat with her head in her hands, her leg bouncing uncontrollably, unable to stop replaying the image of Chelsea collapsing into her arms. Craig, with his hand wrapped in thick white gauze, leaned back in the chair, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might crack a tooth. Ashley was pacing, her phone pressed to her ear as she updated those who were desperate for news. The surgeon's arrival made the entire room hold its breath. Madison was the first to rise, her eyes locking on the man in scrubs. "She's alive," he began, his tone steady, but the injury was severe. "She's lost a lot of blood. We've stabilized her, but the next 24 hours are critical." Madison's knees nearly gave out, relief and terror twisting together. "Can I see her?" Briefly, the surgeon said. "One at a time." While Madison disappeared behind the heavy double doors, Craig sat forward, staring at the floor. "I should have done more," he muttered. "I should have stopped her before." His voice trailed off, but everyone knew who he meant. Ashley put a hand on his shoulder. "Craig, you couldn't have known she'd." "Yes, I could have," he cut in, his voice tight. "I saw the way Allison was looking at them. I saw it weeks ago." Ashley didn't argue. She'd noticed too, but like Craig, she had underestimated just how far Allison's obsession would go. Across the city, Allison sat in an interrogation room, her wrists cuffed loosely in front of her. She wasn't crying, she wasn't even visibly angry anymore. She stared at the table as if waiting for someone to explain the rules of a game she no longer understood. Every so often, her lips would move, murmuring fragments of thoughts only she could hear. When the detective entered, she looked up. Is she dead? Allison asked immediately. She's in surgery, the detective said, withholding the details. What I need to understand, Allison, is why. For a moment, Allison didn't speak. Then she leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. She left me. She said it was the right thing, but she didn't mean it. People don't just stop loving you like that. Not if it's real. The detective let the silence stretch, scribbling notes. Back at the hospital, Madison sat beside Chelsea's bed. The machines beeped steadily, the sound both reassuring and maddening. Chelsea's face was pale, her lips dry, and though her eyes were closed, Madison spoke to her in a low voice, telling her about everything and nothing, how Craig was in the waiting room, how Ashley had nearly punched the detective for delaying updates, how she was going to get Chelsea home and keep her there where no one could hurt her again. What Madison didn't say, what she couldn't admit aloud, was the guilt that gnawed at her. If she hadn't been with Chelsea that night, if she hadn't made her laugh, maybe Allison wouldn't have snapped. It was a thought she couldn't shake. Craig was fighting a different battle. His injury was painful, but it was the betrayal that consumed him. He'd known his marriage to Allison had problems, but he'd never imagined her capable of violence. He thought about their years together, about the subtle changes in her behavior that he dismissed as stress or boredom. Now, each memory felt like a warning he had ignored. Ashley was the one who drifted between them, all between Madison's quiet grief and Craig's simmering anger. She had a knack for holding people together in crises, but this was different. This time, she wasn't sure there was a way to fix what had been broken. The police called later that evening to inform Craig of the formal charges against Allison: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and aggravated battery. Hearing it aloud made it real in a way nothing else had. Craig didn't flinch, he only nodded. She needs to be held accountable, he said flatly. Madison, overhearing, felt torn. Part of her wanted Allison to rot for what she'd done. Another part that remembered the nights the three of them had once laughed together at neighborhood barbecues, wondered how a person could lose themselves so completely. The following days blurred into a tense routine. Chelsea survived the critical period, but her recovery would be long. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her first words a hoarse, "Is Madison okay?" Madison wept openly when she heard it, clutching Chelsea's hand. Craig visited only once in those early days, standing stiffly at the foot of the bed. He couldn't look at Chelsea without thinking of Allison, without feeling the sharp edge of humiliation that his wife's violence had caused. Allison's trial loomed in the background, casting a shadow over every conversation. Ashley was subpoenaed as a witness, as was Madison. Both dreaded the day they would have to face Allison in court. When that day came, Allison entered the courtroom in a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back, her face devoid of makeup. She looked smaller somehow, but her eyes still carried the same unsettling intensity. When Madison took the stand, their gazes met for a fleeting second, and Madison swore she saw a flicker of something: regret, or maybe defiance. Chelsea's testimony was postponed due to her condition, but her written statement was read aloud. The words were simple, unadorned, but each one carried weight. I want to live my life without fear. I want the people I love to be safe. In the end, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Allison showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read, only glancing briefly toward Craig before being led away. Outside the courthouse, Madison stood with Chelsea, who was slowly regaining her strength. The winter air was sharp, the sky pale and cloudless. Craig was there too, his hand still bandaged beneath his coat sleeve. For a moment, they all stood in silence, the enormity of what they'd survived settling in. Ashley broke it first. "It's over," she said, though her tone carried the unspoken truth they would carry the echoes of this night for years. And somewhere in Fairmont Crest, the absence Allison left behind was as heavy as her presence had ever been. Chelsea's recovery was slow but determined. Weeks after Allison's sentencing, she was finally able to walk unassisted, though the scar on her side was a constant reminder of how close she'd come to losing everything. Madison became her shadow, careful not to smother her but unwilling to let her out of sight for long. Every time Chelsea laughed, every time her face lit up at some small joy, a favorite song, the smell of fresh coffee, Madison felt both relief and a sharp fear that something could still take it away. Craig tried to rebuild his life in quieter ways. His marriage to Allison was formally dissolved, though her presence lingered in the form of whispered gossip throughout Fairmont Crest. He avoided the usual social gatherings, retreating into work and home repairs. Sometimes, when the night was too quiet, he would find himself remembering the version of Allison he had loved before her mind unraveled into something dangerous. Those memories didn't excuse her actions, but they reminded him of how fragile people could be, how love could rot into something unrecognizable when pushed too far. Ashley, always the bridge between people, started visiting Craig more often. At first, it was just to check on him, make sure he wasn't drowning in isolation. Over time, they settled into an odd rhythm: shared meals, late-night conversations about everything but Allison. There was no romance, not yet, but there was a familiarity that felt safer than either expected. The trial's aftermath had left Fairmont Crest raw. Neighbors spoke of Allison in hushed tones, and some residents, especially those who had once been close to her, avoided Madison and Chelsea entirely. Madison noticed, but Chelsea brushed it off. "People need a villain," she told her. "Better they think it's her than start blaming us for surviving." Still, there were cracks in the peace. Chelsea received an unsigned letter one afternoon, just a single sentence written in shaky handwriting: "You'll regret what you did to me." There was no return address, but Madison's stomach turned when she read it. She took it to the police, who assured them Allison had no means of sending letters from prison without approval. That meant someone else had written it, someone who still saw Allison as the victim. It was a shadow neither of them wanted, but they couldn't ignore it. Madison quietly upgraded the locks on Chelsea's house and had security cameras installed. Chelsea tried to joke about it, but when she caught Madison sitting up at 3 in the morning with a baseball bat beside her chair, she understood how deep the fear ran. Craig heard about the letter through Ashley. His protective instincts surged, and for the first time since the trial, he visited Chelsea's home. He told her, in that blunt way of his, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her again. Chelsea thanked him, though she wasn't sure if either of them believed protection was that simple anymore. Spring brought small changes. Chelsea returned to part-time work. Madison began sketching again, a hobby she'd abandoned during the chaos, and Craig started venturing into town without feeling every eye on him. The court had denied Allison's appeal, and though the news should have brought closure, it only stirred old emotions. Madison couldn't stop wondering if Allison was sitting in a cell, still blaming them, still imagining a way to twist the story in her favor. Then came the phone call. Late one night, Craig answered to hear a familiar voice on the other end, shaky, almost unrecognizable. It was Allison. Somehow, she had been transferred to a lower security facility for mental health treatment, and in that setting, phone restrictions were looser. She didn't threaten him, she didn't apologize. She only said, "Tell Chelsea I'm sorry she got in the way," before the line went dead. Craig didn't tell Chelsea right away. He struggled with the decision for days, knowing the knowledge could reopen wounds she was trying so hard to heal. When he finally did, Chelsea's reaction wasn't what he expected. She laughed, a sharp, almost bitter sound. "That's the closest thing to an apology she'll ever give," she said. But later that night, Madison found Chelsea standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. "Do you think she'll ever really leave us alone?" Chelsea asked. Madison wrapped her arms around her. "I don't care if she does or doesn't. I'm not going anywhere." Life didn't return to what it was before, that was impossible. But the people left standing learned to live with the shadows Allison had cast. Craig found purpose in volunteering for a local outreach program for victims of domestic and psychological abuse. Ashley took on a leadership role in the community, organizing events that brought neighbors together again. Madison and Chelsea began making plans for a trip, something far from Fairmont Crest, somewhere that didn't hold so many ghosts. And yet, in quiet moments, each of them carried the same unspoken truth: Danger doesn't vanish just because the courtroom lights go out and the sentence is read. Sometimes it lingers, waiting beyond the gates.